This is my story about depression, and I'm sharing this because it seems when I share my adventures, let's call it, with depression, it seems to be helpful for people. So I figure I'll just make a little video, and you can watch it at your leisure. And I'll kind of also put in there a little bit of loneliness because that seems to be a common theme. So just a little bit of background. I am 52 years old. My first bout of depression was in my late 20s, and it was what I would think was situationally induced, meaning that my life wasn't turning out the way I'd hoped. I had wanted to have a family and be married, and I wasn't finding my partner, and life wasn't going that way, and I found my mental health um, going downhill. And I, at that time, was one of the people, and I would say the best way to explain this was that I thought that people that needed self help or needed help were a problem and had a problem. And I just couldn't see myself as having a problem. So I finally had that crisis time when I recognized that um, I had what I called my demons. Basically, I could kind of get through a day, but then when I'd lay down at night, my thoughts would just race, and it was all negative. It was all downhill, and I felt horrible. And I began drinking just to be able to sleep. And I remember Riunite. I didn't like wine at the time, but I would drink a bottle of Riunite just to get through a night of sleep. And I finally got to a crisis point where I had to give up that point of view because it got so bad. So I went to a uh, therapist, a counselor, and I had no connection with the counselor. I basically was there to get her to diagnose me with depression and get me on some meds. And that's what happened. And I did not go into counseling. I can look back and I was pretty hard headed. And so, and then I got through that period, and then things shifted very quickly for me, and things started that I wanted started to happen. The family happened and all of this stuff. And then that happened again. And then I started going through periods of depression. And then it seemed to become a theme, even though I was doing all these really great things in my life, um, stand-up comedy and speaking and developing workshops around personal boundaries and psychotherapy and really fun things and acting and improv and but I was still having these periods of time where I was lonely and I would get depressed, and it started to become a pattern with me. And one thing that I could recognize was the just this the excitement and joy wasn't available in my world. So I'd recognize kind of what depression was and how to pull me out of it. I wasn't on antidepressants for very long, like 9 months. It was a low dose of Wellbutrin. But I didn't go back to I didn't really want to go back to pharmaceuticals. And so what I figured out was how to manage my depression. And so what I started to notice was that I had these different stages, and I finally became very mindful, and I started paying attention to what was happening within my system and really paying attention when I would go through these spells of depression. And I know that I relate with a lot of people saying that um, it's kind of an embarrassing thing, like there's something wrong with you. And I started to really push that away, that idea that there was something wrong with me, and started to just realize that this seemed to be some kind of function that I was going to be dealing with in my life, and I needed to figure out, how to manage it. And so I was pretty good at it. And if I started to feel myself dipping into my depressions, and what I mean by that is, so I came up with these different levels of my depression. And so there was this period of this like level of depression which I call rice cake. So if you've ever had one of those little round rice cakes, they're rice and they're like they were a health food kick thing for a little while. But they're very lightly salted or flavored, and so they can be very dry. So if you're used to like really robust flavors, these little things are just not that. They just have this little tint of seasoning to them. So I relate to that because that's how my cells felt in my body at this level of depression. Was I would feel what I call rice cake, and it was like I could feel just the inklings of upward momentum of like, so I could manage it by going outside and exercising. That's when I felt rice cake coming on. It was time to get out and start exercising. It would start to listen to my music. I could feel the music in my cells, and it would feel good. But then I would get trapped in the next level, which was what I would call styrofoam. And this level of depression was, this is the deepest and the hardest, because the way that I relate with this is styrofoam is just no feeling, no sensation in my body. And so like I couldn't put on my favorite music and feel anything inside of my body. And, if you know, and I learned that that's how we animate in this world, is by our sensations. Well, your thoughts go along with your sensations. So if your body feels good, oftentimes you have good, happy thoughts. Well, when you're in styrofoam, it feels like work, because your mind cannot find happy things to connect to. That is a depth of loneliness. That is a depth of despair. That is what I would say that people that talk to depression about their depression, that's like the lowest. That's the lowest level of depression, is that just don't feel connected at all. So what I discovered by paying attention to all of this was, how do I manage it? Well, the first thing is, if I felt rice cake coming on, I would start doing the things that was good, like listening to music, doing more meditation, getting out and exercising, these kind of things. But if I ever found myself down at styrofoam, so there have been different crisis points within the evolution of my depression. And the crisis points were those points where people would say that's like when you're ready to end it, in suicidal. But I don't want to call it that. Let's call it the crisis point, where you're soaking in that. And I was soaking in that. And I recognized that I had to take a different perspective of it. Otherwise, it was going to drag me down. So that's kind of like, it's a very visceral feeling of the thoughts that come. So when I was in those depressed states, especially styrofoam, what I could understand about the thoughts that were happening in my head, they would go into a downward trajectory. And I would go into these looping to the point where I'd reach that numbness and those crisis points all the time, where I would feel that helplessness, that loneliness, despair, and start asking this question, like, why am I putting myself through this? Why can I, what is this all about? Like, I can't do this anyway. That's when I discovered that I had to do something different. I had to look at this differently. And this is really the part that I really wanted to share with people is, and I'll talk a little bit more about things that I've done to manage the depression, that sort of thing. But this is what I came to, I came up to this idea. Remember I was saying that my thoughts would be going downward, spiraling downward. And what I realized was I had to, if I'm going to be trying, if I'm going to be efforting to do something to move myself out of that depression, I had to do something else. So what I began to do is what I named chin up. And what this meant was chin up, like I can't hang my head down. The thoughts would keep bringing my head down, would keep bringing me lower into that depression. I had to start adjusting the lens inside of my mind into an upward trajectory. And this isn't, at first you want this to be like, I'm going to be positive and it's going to happen overnight. And I didn't find that that was the case, especially when you're in that styrofoam stage. Like getting your thoughts to start taking an upward trajectory feels like probably the hardest work you can ever imagine, because you're working with your mind without the body sensations lifting you or giving you any escort to help you out of it. So it was just a daily mantra that, as soon as I'd feel that depression coming in waves, it was chin up, chin up, chin up, chin up. Get those thoughts going upwards. Get those thoughts going upwards. Get those thoughts going upwards. And what I discovered, this didn't change me like immediately, but it certainly gave me hope, especially in my crisis points, because now I had a new strategy. And now it took me a while, especially the first time after I developed this idea of chin up, it took me over time to begin to pull myself out of styrofoam and into rice cake. Because at rice cake, I knew what I could do. I knew exercise. I knew fresh air. I knew meditation. I knew the music that felt good. I tried to work with my thoughts and that sort of thing. So it was always trying to go from styrofoam, always lifting the chin, lifting the chin to get me to, okay, tomorrow's going to be a little bit better. My thoughts are going to start going up, and then I'm going to have the synapses or whatever's going on inside my body where my cells can now feel again and I can pull myself out. And so that's kind of what I did in the short term, but I developed this as a rhythm that became kind of a habit in my world, which was chin up, chin up, chin up, chin up. And that helped me discover that what chinning up did was something more than just adjusting my lens to trying to get those thoughts to go upwards. It literally changed my reality, because with the upward trajectory, it started to provoke in me a desire to seek out. And then my attention wanted to focus on things that had to do with getting the things I was experiencing to be, I could focus on them in a positive way. And as soon as I started to do that, I started to find all the information, and that's how our minds work. We actually have a thing called the reticular activating system within us that looks for relevant things that we're interested in, and chinning up always brought me into, these higher ways of thinking and looking at things. So my loneliness and my depression, I began to just refocus it and the perspective I had with the experiences I was going through. And it changed my life. It changed my whole view of grief, and it changed my whole view of loneliness. I don't suffer from loneliness anymore. And I also don't, and it didn't make me go out and be social. I can spend lots and lots of time by myself and not feel lonely. And that only happened from finding that perspective shift. So a lot of times people talk about, and oftentimes people talk about, I've been on antidepressants for a long time and I want to get off them. And I am not antidepressant. I am about your advocate, you being your own advocate. What are ways that help you get out of it and work with it? And that's the thing where I see a lot of people get stuck in using antidepressants as just staying in rice cake. And that's what I would hope, or for, because I can see that that's what they want to do, is they want to get off the medication, because they want to get out of, they don't just want to live managing their depression. They want to get out and they want to start experiencing the world. And so that's something that you work with. And, my greatest advice to you in this, what I would say from my thing, is get this going, get the chin up, start getting the thoughts going up. That'll lead you into ideas. And I'm happy to share my ideas with anybody on what I discovered about, what was the depression about. Oftentimes it was about, having an expectation for the outside world that wasn't meeting it. And, the way that I looked at grief and the loss of relationships, all of these things, I just started to change the lens, and that changed the trajectory of my life. And I live my life now in such profound gratitude, joy. I feel belonging. I feel the sensation of home the majority of the time in my world. And that's the way I experience it all the time. But I also have to tell you that depression is not gone. Like, there was a time where I was like, I don't want this beast in my world anymore. It's like, I want it to be gone. And now I look at depression as part of my journey. It's part of my journey. And sometimes I just feel like I have to, I'm extraordinarily, I would say, skilled now at sensing rice cake coming and shifting everything around. And within hours to days, I'm out of rice cake, and I'm happy, and I'm joyful, and I'm back to my regular self. So sometimes I just feel like, and I don't know. These are things I'm not trying to figure out whether I can get rid of depression altogether in my life, because sometimes I feel like it's still there as like a little ember of a memory that keeps going along, and it just reminds me of the journey I went on, and kind of gives me a growth spurt, or growth understanding from my perspective of like what I've done, and if it was just all gone, I could say, oh, well, I healed my depression. And then what good am I, when I'm talking to somebody that's going through depression, because I know what it feels like to go through depression. It is, it's almost like being stuck in a room, and you're just looking for anything to soothe yourself, and there's nothing there to feel. It feels like a prison. And sometimes I feel like I still have those bursts, those little remnants that come into my life, just so that I can continue to empathize and to continue to share with my journey about how I got through it and that sort of thing. And so, and a lot of people ask me, well, we have this new revolution with psychedelics, and did you use that? Have you used psychedelics in order to manage depression? And I have. And so I was going through another bout of styrofoam. I can't remember how long it goes. I have a hard time with chronological time these days, but it may have been 4 or 5 years ago. And I had discovered the idea of magic mushrooms, the psilocybin. And then I had started studying. This is where my attention went to things that were relevant to me. And I started finding out about this thing called microdosing of psilocybin. And so I was like, okay, that's something I should do. And I ended up finding somebody, this is how the universe works, somebody that had just moved to Colorado, and they had a business, and they were selling microdoses. And so I started on microdoses, and it was amazing. It only took, I think, 1 week, and I was back to rice cake. And that's the way that I would say microdosing was for me. It was my tool to lift me out of styrofoam and get me into rice cake. So I wasn't making, I don't make my antidepressant or magic mushrooms responsible for my depression. Like, it's not going to cure me. That's not the way I look at it. I look at it as a tool to get me from styrofoam to rice cake, and I'm on my way. I can get that upward, the chin up, chin up, chin up, and I can move through it. And then I grew them for a while, and used them both macro and microdosing. And yes, they were very helpful. And, you just have to, and people ask me, well, is it going to solve my problems? And you'll know. You know what is going to be right for you. You'll know when it's right for you. And I also just want to say that we're all in this human thing together. And if I can be helpful to anyone else, to anyone that's going through this, I'm happy to share my experience. And that's one thing that I've learned from my depression was vulnerability. And a lot of my depressions were experiencing shame and not reaching out and letting people know. And then, you run into this other phenomenon where, I know beautiful human beings and they just have hearts the size of Mount Everest. And then I explain to them depression, and they've never had to deal with it, and their eyeballs spin, and I can see that they just can't understand what I've gone through. And that's why I'm making this video, is because I've been there. And that's what I determined, is that I wouldn't even see a counselor unless they've dealt with it themselves. Unless you've actually been there in depression, you've experienced it, you really don't know what it's like to experience depression. And people that experience depression, we need to talk about it so people can really understand that it isn't the thing that they think it is. And that's kind of what I get, is that they think that, you just don't, you haven't found happy thoughts, or, if you're watching this video, you probably know what people assume if you were ever to open up your mouth about depression. So, and that's another thing, though. I would say that I'm saying that find people that understand depression, but if other people, you can relate with other people that have depression, but if their trajectory is, if their chins are down and their minds are going down, probably not where you want to put your focus. You want to put your focus on people that understand, but are looking for that chin up experience to move past it. So I hope this is helpful.